maybe fun? Okay, fine. Wait, so I think we're going to kick off again. And we're going to take what I like to call for lack of a better term, a tactical pause. And I want to draw everyone's attention to something that I've just placed on the screen right now. And that's a program called Bounce Back. And I'd be amiss if I didn't mention the program, try and sell you the program, despite the fact it's free. Bounce Back is part of Ontario's commitment to providing psychotherapy to Ontarians. It's for individuals over the age of 15, okay, anyone 15 and up, from a teenager to someone in their 80s. And it's a coaching program that is cognitive behavioral therapy based, which includes talk therapy using a coach over a telephone, as well as a workbook-based program that you engage in after being referred into the program. So why workbooks? Well, overwhelmingly, if you ever go to a psychologist and your primary complaint is anxiety or depression, they're going to tell you to do one of two things. Go and buy the Anxiety and Phobia Workbook, version 6 or whatever version it is now, which costs you about $100, or go and buy Mind Over Mood, or whichever version it is on now, I think version 4, version 5, which will cost you $100, right, in order to help guide you through the CBT process, right? Or a version of those workbooks. I think they might have one that they prefer. But what Bounce Back does is it gives you the books for free, and it gives you access to a coach that is supervised by a clinician to speak with weekly or bi-weekly or monthly over the phone as you work through the workbooks. The reason why I'm bringing up Bounce Back and why I think it's a really great program, especially for this group of people right here, is it's available in over 16 languages, both the workbooks and the coaching. So one of the major complaints that you might hear in your communities in which you conduct work is the lack of resources available for individuals that might speak a language other than English or French, right? If they speak Farsi, they can access this program. If they speak Arabic, they can access this program. If they speak Punjabi, they can access this program. Spanish, access this program. Portuguese, access this program. Over 16 languages, right? So all that has to happen is they have to go to their primary care provider, right? Or a nurse practitioner, someone that can write a script, and the primary care provider has to fill out this form. All this information can be found on bounceback.ca, or sorry, bouncebackontario.ca. And they fill out this form, and as long as the individual is not experiencing severe depression, right, so the PHQ score is over 21, then they can be referred to the program. As long as the individual is not at risk of harm to themselves or others, right, so isn't actively expressing suicidal ideation or behaviors, or has not commented on thoughts of harming others, then they can be referred to the program. They're not significantly misusing alcohol or drugs, right? So they don't have an active substance use disorder. Doesn't mean that they can't, you know, if you're 20 and you're having a beer every game night when you're watching a hockey game, that's fine. It's if you're misusing alcohol or drugs. You don't have a personality disorder that has been diagnosed, right? So one of the personality disorders found in the ICD or the DSM. Haven't had an active manic or psychotic episode within the last 6 months. Okay, so it doesn't mean that you haven't had one in the past, but within the last 6 months. And then finally, that you're capable of engaging with the program, right? So there's not a concern about a developmental disability or something like that. That's going to preclude you from engaging without support. It's almost entirely, apart from the primary care physician, anonymous, right? So the benefit to this is if you have let's say a youth that doesn't necessarily want to have to go and ask their parents to take them to a psychologist's office, the youth can call after being referred the program, if they're 15 or 16 years old, without their parents knowing about it. Right? That's privileged information between them and their doctor. And it is accessible in multiple languages. The topics for the workbooks, or the topics that might be covered, are things like you're feeling like you're stuck. There's this feeling of stuckedness, and we're going to talk about that when we talk about anxiety and stress in a second. Understanding low mood and depression, right? So what does it mean to be depressed? What does that look like? How does that feel? How do you get out of that? Things like practical problem solving, right? So if you have difficulty making decisions or difficulty with procrastination, it'll help them with that, especially in the context of something like anxiety or stress. If they're looking to quit smoking, if they're looking to understand alcohol or limit their alcohol intake, because that's been an issue, these are all things that the program will cover. Okay, and it's absolutely free in the province of Ontario. So I really encourage if you, maybe, or a loved one, or people that you work with would be interested in this, please let them know about the program. Any questions about that before we move on? Yeah? Right now, I haven't heard of a waiting period that's prohibitive in nature. Really, the biggest lag will be you getting an appointment with your doctor, with a nurse practitioner, doctor filling out the form, and then the form getting mailed out or faxed out to the program. That might be a wait, but right now there isn't one. And there are contingencies in place in order to ramp up capacity if waiting lists become too severe. But right now there isn't it's not like you're waiting 8 weeks, or 8 months, I should say. 15 and up. No upper limit, just 15 and up. And like I said, just the exclusionary factors would be active psychosis or mania in the last 6 months, misusing alcohol or drugs, diagnosed personality disorder, like borderline or histrionic or narcissism or something like that. Then as well, if your score on the PHQ is above 21. The one thing that I will say is you can print out the referral forms to have in your offices, but do not allow people to fill out the forms themselves, because they'll freak themselves out. Because they'll fill out the form and then they'll say, oh my God, what does this score mean? You cannot do a self-assessment for any psychological questionnaire or status check, right? So please, like if you're handing out the forms, just take it to their doctor, just make sure they're not filling them out themselves, because it won't be accurate and they might scare themselves. So I noticed that I would bring brochures in and then people would be filling out the forms, and I'd have 10 people after every session come to me and say, what does this mean? And I say, I have no clue. You filled it out yourself. It has no meaning, right? So just make sure that they're taking it to a doctor to fill out. Any other questions? Yeah. Yeah, so there has to be a primary care provider that is conducting the referral, because they have to issue out the PHQ, which all PCPs should be able to issue, right, as part of their training now. And it's also a fallback in case there are concerns about the individual's maybe behavior or mood as the program progresses, that they might want to be referred back to a primary care provider in order to get access through the psychiatric system, right? So it's a safety mechanism that's in place. But there are multiple safety mechanisms. So if you're on the call with the counselor, every time you start a call, there's always a mental status check that's done and all that kind of stuff. So there's check-ins that are regularly performed. Yep.
So just now you mentioned, like, for years over 15,
yep.
they don't want their parents to know what's going on. They can call, but
yep.
You still needs to be referred through the school, social worker, or?
No, it's just a primary care practitioner. So their family doctor, if they see a family doctor, if they have a nurse practitioner at the school, and the nurse practitioner knows about the program or can refer them to the program. A social worker cannot refer. it's pretty much you're reliant on someone that can write a prescription. So a primary care provider, a physician of some sort, or a nurse practitioner. But most schools now, to my knowledge at least, have a nurse practitioner, I think, on site, or many do, so it shouldn't be an issue if you're going through the school system. Yeah. Any other questions about that? No? Okay. All right, so we all broke for lunch. We're probably what I like to call a little bit food drunk, which means we're really sleepy because we're trying to digest, right? So I really thank you for being awake and attentive. Because I always have difficulty after lunch unless I'm standing talking to you instead of listening. But refer back to that spectrum again, right? So how we talked about balance being in the fulcrum, in the center, right? That the disk continues to rotate. You're not moving north or south along it, or east or west along that axis, right? It's well balanced. It's not tipping. It's not wobbly. And the fact that balance for all of us is something different, right? There might be some commonalities between us, right? Like maybe my definition of resiliency is the same as your definition, but our definitions of perhaps what security means could be quite different, right? Depending on our cultural backgrounds, depending on just what security means for us, right? But balance exists for everyone in some way, shape, or form. And the fact that when we talk about problems and illnesses, again, bringing you back to this, that we're talking about something sustained over a period of time. So how many people here have been stressed before? Raise your hand. Some of you are liars. It's always the same people that are lying. Right, we've all felt stressed before. That is normal, right? And just being stressed does not mean that we're experiencing an anxiety disorder, right? It doesn't mean that, I feel stressed certain parts of the day or certain parts of the week and that I have generalized anxiety disorder. No, that's not the case, right? It just means that I'm feeling stressed. I'm a human being. It's normal, right? And that feeling of stress is a good thing sometimes, right? When would stress be a good thing? What's an example of maybe a good reason to feel stress? Yeah.
Exam.
Say again?
Exam, if you have an exam.
Yeah, so maybe it's motivating you to actually study instead of, not study and stay up all night, or
Getting a job.
getting a job. That can be stressful, right? But it's good stress, right? New job, new challenges. What else? Having deadlines are important because otherwise we would never get anything done, right? We would just let things.
Going to the interview.
Yeah, going to an interview, right? So stress can be a good thing, right? Has anyone here gotten married before? Was that stressful? Yeah, right? Yeah?
Having a baby and newborn.
There you go, having a newborn, right? What about buying a house for the first time or moving? Stressful, right? Right? But usually these events that we say are like massively stressful, they're pretty happy events in our lives, right? Like having a kid or having a newborn, getting married, moving. Ideally is a happy point, right? Because you're moving to somewhere where you want to be moving to, ideally. So these moments of time are usually very, very happy. Graduating from school, right? High school. When you graduate from high school, you're freaked out. Where are you going next for university, right? What does university mean? You're graduating from university. Oh my God, now I've got to actually get a job, right? Like all these things that happen in these major life moments. So stress can be a good thing. Right? So what is stress to you? What does it feel like?
Not comfortable.
Not feeling comfortable, kind of feeling antsy, like you got to move around, yeah. Overwhelmed, absolutely. Less in control, increased heart rate, good. Anxious, good. I want to pause there for a second, though. Hopeless? Focused. Okay, good. I'm going to come back to that because I'm glad you said anxiety, but we're going to come back to that. So, focus. Sometimes stress makes us focus, right? Or unfocused, yeah. You can have the opposite effect, too.
Being uncertain.
Uncertainty, absolutely, yeah. What else?
Having neck pain.
Neck pain, yeah. So physical aches and pains, your physical symptoms, right? Anyone ever gotten tunnel vision? Like their vision is kind of going like this? Yeah? Or whooshing in the ears? Yeah? Okay. Dry mouth? Yeah?
Want to try it?
Wanting to cry, absolutely.
Sweating.
Sweating profusely, yeah, absolutely. So these are all symptoms of stress. Stress, like we talked about though, can be good and bad, right? Like, so we can feel bad stress sometimes, and then we can feel good stress, right? This kind of stress that makes us focus, sit down, get our work done, do really well on a test, do really well on an exam, or, just rock that project and make sure that it's in on time and that people are happy with it, those kind of things, right? But then there's bad stress, right? And that bad stress, if we leave it too long, can start to become anxiety. And I like to describe stress as being about the moment. Stress is the moment you're in, right? It's what's happening to you in that moment, and that's what's making you feel stressed. Anxiety is about the future. Anxiety is about what's going to happen to you. What if? Or, you're catastrophizing. You're having those ruminative thoughts, those intrusive thoughts that come into your brain and tell you that something bad is going to happen, right? That's anxiety. Anxiety is about the future. Stress is about the present. I'd like a volunteer.
I want to say anxiety also is something that you potentially feel that you're losing in the future.
Yeah, it could be that too, right? So it could be something that you're worried about losing or not having happen as well, right? It can be a negative and a positive from that perspective. Volunteer? It's not scary? Okay, excellent. So what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to read the color that the word is, not the word itself. So for example, the first line would be green, red, blue.
Okay. Green, red, blue, yellow, blue, black, red, purple, green, black, red, yellow, green, purple, black, purple, red, green.
Okay, that's pretty good. Yeah. All right, second volunteer wasn't too hard, right? Yeah? Okay, perfect. So I'd like you to do the same thing that she just did, but if I can use you again, what I'd like you to do is tell her to hurry up, that she's not doing a good job, that she should try a bit harder. Be as mean as you can, short of the point of abuse or harassment, essentially, what I'm saying, right? Yeah, go ahead.
Let's go. You can do this. Come on. We need to pass. Let's go. Come on. No. Faster, please. Faster. Let's go. We're running out of time. Come on, people. Let's go.
Okay, excellent. Yeah. So some people are like that, and it always makes me have to work a lot harder because I can't use it as an example. Some people just focus and they're like, I'm getting this done, I'm drowning everyone else out. It looks like that's what happened. And then sometimes the person I ask to be mean about it gets really anxious and really stressed. And it's like, oh my god, I can't do that. But this is an example of what we call a Stroop test, right? It's to check for cognitive dissonance or breakdowns in cognition, right? So the ability to process information. And when we conduct these kind of tests when we're under a stressor, we do really poorly at them. Right? This is a very simple one, but there's more complex examples, right? And the minute we introduce a stressor into that environment, the person does quite poorly on the test, right? And we've all experienced this before, right? Like we're really stressed about an exam, and despite the fact that we could probably answer every question on it, we flunk it because we were just so worked up about it, right? Or we've all seen it if you watch American football ever. The quarterback passes the ball to the wide receiver's running, it looks like he's got it, and it just falls right in front of him in between his arms, right? We've all seen that happen. Or someone misses a goal on an open net in hockey, or a football player misses a kick and goes flying and falls on their back, right? And they spend 20 minutes rubbing their knee and complaining about it. That's football for you, right? Soccer. So we've all seen this happen, right? And stressors cause us to not perform. So stress is responsive to circumstance, right? It's responsive to social circumstance, right? Anyone here gets stressed in social environments? I'm one of those people. Despite the fact I'm here talking to you, like public speaking, I'm terrible at a party. I'm the kind of person that's going to go find the person's cat that lives with them and pet it and then try and look at their bookshelf and see what they read on a regular basis, I'm not going to want to interact with everyone else at the party. I'm not that kind of person, right? For other people, it might be physical stress, right? So having a chronic illness is stressful. Having a disability is stressful. Being sick is stressful, especially for those of us that experience man colds. Right? You can laugh at that, that's a joke. Mental stress, right? Cognitive stress. The kind of stress we feel when we're doing something difficult for the first time, or studying for an exam, or working through a problem that's we just can't seem to grasp right away. Right? So those are all examples of stress. A disorder might occur when a barrier prevents our stress response from regulating. Right? So everyone, unless you were one of the liars, raised your hand when I asked if you've ever been stressed before. And are you stressed right now? I hope not. I hope I'm not stressing you out. Right? But our stress response regulates. It waxes and wanes. Right? So we're stressed one moment, you get an email that seems really urgent, and you're kind of, this is causing a lot of stress or anxiety right now. And then you send off a response, and then your stress response regulates, and you're back down to baseline. Right? But a disorder occurs when a barrier prevents that response from regulating, and so now stress just keeps compounding on us, right? So it keeps building and building and building and building. I'd like everyone to have a cup in front of them. Yeah, can I just get you to hold your cup up like this, or a water bottle, whatever it is, right? And I want you to think about how much is in that cup, right? Is it half full? Is it half empty? Are you the kind of person that thinks of it half full, half empty? Right? And keep holding the cup up like this, right? And what would the cup picture, how would it feel if it was full? Or how it was empty? Right? And I'm being kind of mean about it because the cup, it doesn't matter how full or empty the cup is, right? I'm asking you to hold something like this in a plyometric stance, and it's causing your arm, especially your shoulder, to get a bit fatigued, right? So even if the cup was empty, like my cup is, my shoulder's starting to ache a little bit, so I'm moving it around, right? And it's because at the end of the day, stress can compound upon itself. Right? It doesn't matter if there's a lot of stress in the cup or no stress in the cup. It's just a very minor bit of stress, like a drag. It's still hard on the arm, right? You put your fast, right? So stress compounds upon itself. It's not necessarily it's a really stressful period of time. It's the end of fiscal year, and you're an accountant, or it's really just a little bit of stress. If something's preventing that response from regulating, it's just going to build upon itself, and it might cause an injury, right, or a disorder to develop. And the most common is going to be an anxiety disorder, right? We've all heard about anxiety disorders, I'm sure, despite the fact that if you were to open up the DSM right now, the most current iteration of the DSM, despite the fact there's probably about 30, 40 pages on mood disorders, right? There's like 150 pages on anxiety disorders. Everything under the sun can be an anxiety disorder. How many people here are scared of snakes? They don't like snakes. Yeah? Okay, anyone here, like, even the thought of a snake causes them to start getting kind of, antsy? So that might be an example of a phobia, right? How about heights? Anyone here? How many people here cannot, like, even think about doing the walk around the rim on the CN Tower or whatever it's called? Right? So that's an example of phobia, an anxiety disorder, right? Some more common ones are going to be things like generalized anxiety. So that's an excessive or an undue amount of worry about normal everyday life things, right? Like finances or school or relationships or work, right? So that would be generalized anxiety. There's other forms of anxiety, like what used to be called hypochondria, so excessive worry about health concerns, right? Obsessive compulsive disorder used to be an anxiety disorder. Now it's separate, but still considered very similar to anxiety disorders. There's personality-based disorders, which are very close to anxiety disorders, like obsessive-compulsive personality disorder or histrionic personality disorder. Right? There's tons. Like, it's pretty much anything you can think of is either a phobia or causes anxiety in someone else. Right? So it's important to understand that despite the fact there's a lot, they all follow a very similar process. And we can place anxiety on the spectrum as well, right? So if you recall that balance is that at that fulcrum, right? The top is spinning, nice and easy, it's not wobbling. And then you put a foot over here into the 6 or the 7, and now it's going to start to wobble, right? You're off of kilter, you're off balance. And that 6, 7, that level of anxiety is probably, you're going to feel hyper aroused, right? Like you're looking for a threat in your environment. You might feel overstimulated, right? So it's difficult to sit still. things are a lot louder than they should be, or things are moving a lot quicker than they actually are. Easily distractible, right? So with that Stroop test, that's a perfect example. If someone's screaming at you in your ear, or tapping you on the forehead while you're trying to do it, it's going to be a lot harder to do that task. Irritable, right? I asked you earlier today how many of you have snapped at someone, and most of you were honest about it. Some of you were liars. But I'm going to keep coming back to that. But for the most part, we've all been irritable when we're stressed at some point in time, right? And it might feel like our body is buzzing. Really early on in the presentation, I asked if how many people here got nauseous when they're anxious. And the reason for that is because I wanted to demonstrate that there's a somatic component to mental illness, right? That the dysregulation that's occurring in our brain is occurring elsewhere in the body. And one of the most common things when you're diagnosed with an anxiety disorder for the first time is your primary care provider or your psychiatrist, whoever is prescribing a pill or a script, is going to prescribe something called an SSRI, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor. Right? And what that SSRI does is within the nerve synapse, right? There's part of the synapse that sends off the neurochemical, right, into the synaptic cleft, and then the other side sucks it all up, right? And then the stuff that doesn't get sucked up from the synaptic cleft goes back into the giver, right? The right-hand end of this diet. And what an SSRI does is it allows that serotonin to sit in that cleft longer, right? So that you're constantly taking it up into the other side of the synapse, which gives you more serotonin in your brain, or more access to more serotonin in your brain, I should say, which we don't know for sure, improves mood, right? But only about 10-20% of your serotonin is actually in your brain. Where's the other 80%? In your intestines. So if there's dysregulation in your brain, there's dysregulation everywhere in the body. It's not just a brain issue, right? It's a whole body issue. So that's why when people are very stressed or very anxious, they throw up, or they get the runs, or they start getting a stomachache, or the first time you take Zoloft or Prozac or one of these pills, a lot of the time you'll either gain weight or lose weight, or you'll have difficulty with digestion, right? It's because it's having an effect on the whole body, not just the brain. So there's a somatic component to mental illness, particularly anxiety disorders. We talk about muscle tension in the neck, right? Having a headache, maybe getting a migraine, having aches and pains in joints, right? That's happening because their muscles are tensing up, right? They're getting ready. If you think back to my conversation earlier about the amygdala, right? That's a good process for us to have, right? It's good that we shut down the part of our brain that takes a while to work out problems, and we activate the part of the brain that's just, action. And the reason for that is because it's a survival mechanism. 20,000 years ago, if we were standing right here, it would be a jungle or a forest or whatever. Well, probably a plain because it was the Ice Age. But, we're walking around, as we do 20,000 years ago, and we come across a saber-toothed tiger. Right? And we would have to make a snap-second decision whether or not we poked the saber-toothed tiger with the stick we had, or we ran away from it. And the reason we're all here is because our great-great-grandfather, to the 10th power, decided not to poke the tiger with the stick and to run away. He made the right decision. And the reason why our cousin Jimmy isn't around today is because our great-great-great-great-uncle to the power of 10 decided to try to poke the tiger with the stick, and it didn't work out for him. Right? And that's what his amygdala is telling him to do. So the amygdala is a great tool to have because it activates when we need it to activate, when we need it to respond to a threat in our environment. But if it's constantly activating, the brain can't tell the difference between being stressed because of school exams and being stressed because you're getting hunted by a tiger. There's no difference between the process that's occurring in the brain right now, right? So that's why when you're experiencing high anxiety and someone comes up to you and says, it's not that bad, you're pretty ticked off with them, right? Because it feels pretty bad, right? It doesn't feel like it's not that bad. It feels pretty bad. And if we exist long enough in that level 6 or level 7, we're more apt to experience a crisis. And what does a crisis look like? Well, it might be a panic attack, right? So that that bubbling up of all that anxious energy resulting in a panic attack. It could be a manic episode, right? It could be psychosis, so a break from reality. And it could also be suicidal ideation and thoughts of suicide. And any one of those things we could accurately describe as a crisis. From a personal perspective, I was at a youngish age, I was in my mid-late teens, was diagnosed with OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder. And what was happening at the time think I was 15 or 16, I can't remember, is I was experiencing what happens when you have OCD, which was intrusive thoughts, and then a ruminative cycle because of those intrusive thoughts. And my intrusive thoughts predominantly dealt with anxieties and worries around contamination, pretty typical for OCD. Being a bad person, right? So like if I was driving a car and I hit a little bump, I'd have to circle back 10, 15 times to make sure it wasn't a kid that I had hit. Because I would have this intrusive thought telling me, you hit a kid, you hit a kid, you hit a kid, and I'd have to circle back. And then you'd hit another bump, and then you'd circle back again, because that might have been the kid when you were checking to see if the other bump was the kid, right? And for lack of a better term, I thought I was going insane. Right? I was worried I was going to lose touch from reality and just go insane. And I was upstairs in my room thinking about this, really upset, really distraught, 15 or 16 years old, and I walked downstairs to my parents, they were watching television at the time, and said, Mom, Dad, you need to commit me, I'm about to lose my mind. Right? Because I was experiencing two things in relation to the anxiety. One was depersonalization, which is this feeling as though the things that happen to you as an individual are not actually happening to you, they're happening to someone else. And then derealization, which is this experience of unreality. So conversations you have, or things that you do, it feels as though there's a separation between you and that thing that you're doing. It feels like you're walking through cotton wool. It's actually a dissociative process, quite common with youth when they experience high levels of anxiety or stress. And walked downstairs and said, Mom, Dad, you got to commit me, I think I'm going insane. And my father laughed and said, you're not going insane, you know, just relax, because he's an engineer and has difficulty connecting with human emotions. Laugh at that, that's a joke. And my mother said, no, let's take you to a doctor and we'll get you checked out. And eventually, I got referred to a psychologist, diagnosed me, or said this is probably it, because my psychologist didn't like putting labels on things, which is excellent. I think that's an awesome way to approach psychology. And eventually was able to come off the medication that I was taking, stop conducting regular CBT, and within a couple of years, I would say I was at what I would determine or call recovery. And somehow I passed the CFAT and the psychological exam for the military, and there you go. So who knows what happened there. But I was probably, looking back at it, always a 7 or an 8 growing up. Like I remember as young as like 8 or 7 or 6, if I was in the bathtub, I'd have to turn the tap on 10, 15 times, otherwise I might drown if I didn't do that compulsion. If I didn't turn the tap on and off 15 or 10 times. If I was walking across the street and you know how there's a countdown with the hand and it blinks, I have to cross in between 10 and 5, counting down, otherwise I'd be hit by a car. And I grew up like this, like just thinking like this and having we call it magical thinking, because there's no relation to those thoughts within reality. But, I was always a 7 or an 8, and so you can imagine whenever I experience something bad, I shift further and further to the left or to the right, depending on your perspective here, right? And so now I probably call myself a 5 or 6. I'm still pretty, I guess, high energy, you could say, or, I still hyper-focus on certain things, but I don't experience the same things I experienced as a youth, right? So everyone's form or definition of balance is different, right? And everyone's experience is going to be different. And I want you to think about that as we move forward. So, first thing to know about anxiety, just like I told you, well, first it's treatable, and it can happen to anyone, right? Anxiety is a normal part of life, but especially anxiety disorder is one of the most commonly diagnosed mental illnesses. How do we recognize it? Well, worry goes up, right? So we start to worry about something. Something gets caught in our head, and we start to just hyper-focus and analyze it. I like to describe anxiety as this feeling of stuckedness. Like we can't pick our feet up out of a bunch of molasses, and we're just stuck with those thoughts, right? And even though we can take a step forward, it feels it's even harder to take the next foot up. And then we bring the next foot forward, and then we're still stuck because now we're thinking about something different, right? Anxiety is an incredibly frustrating experience for many people. This feeling of restlessness, right? Like you can't sit still. And that's your parasympathetic nervous system telling you that you got to move because that tiger's chasing you, right? Irritability goes up, right? We snap at people we love, we get angry in the car, we react to things in ways we shouldn't react to them. Tension goes up, right? So headaches, muscle tension. Concentration is going to go down, harder to concentrate, harder to focus. Sleep is going to suffer because of anxiety, right? You don't sleep well when you're anxious or stressed. Does anyone here sleep like a baby when they're stressed? No? And then energy is going to go down, right? Because you're not sleeping well, and you're probably not eating all that well either, right? What are are some risk factors? Well, first and foremost, obviously stress, right? If you spend a really long time in a period of high stress, you're going to experience a higher risk of developing an anxiety disorder. So some professions we look at are things like lawyers, brokers, individuals in very high stress, fast-paced environments, individuals that work in environments that don't have a lot of stability, right? Trauma is obviously a risk factor, right? So not necessarily in the context of something like PTSD, which is separate from anxiety disorders, but maybe in the context of something like an operational or occupational stress injury, right? So anxiety disorders can be an OSI. Illnesses, right? Overwhelmingly, individuals that experience chronic illness or palliative illness or chronic disability experience higher rates of anxiety disorders. The environment, right? So just the environment that you exist in, whether or not it's safe, whether it's hectic or frantic or disorganized, that can increase the risk of developing an anxiety disorder. And then finally, substance use, right? So the chronic use of substances that might be maladaptive or not healthy puts you at a higher risk of developing an anxiety disorder because of that, especially the uppers, right? So things like cocaine or methamphetamine. Resource options, first and foremost, psychotherapy, right? So just like with depression, the incidence of success after 10 years is almost the exact same between CBT and medication, all right? Mindfulness techniques. Anyone here have a mindfulness technique they use? Breathing, deep breathing? Yep, good, excellent, that's a great one. Anyone else? Meditation, yeah, excellent, that's a really good one.
Yoga.
Say again?
Going to yoga.
Yoga?
Mini yoga.
Yep. Yeah, excellent, right? Muscle relaxation. Meditation, yeah. Say again? Acupuncture, yeah, that can be an example of one. Hard to do in the moment, right? Like if you're, but no, certainly that can be something protective in nature. Yeah.
They have the ones that they put the seeds in your finger.
Okay, I've never heard of that before, but that's cool. I used to have a rock that I would carry around. I don't have it today. I should start bringing it because I bring it sometimes. No break. But it was a fossil that I had found in the Arctic. So one of the units I was with was responsible for Arctic reconnaissance and response, and I found it on the Bering Sea at the edge of where the Pacific meets the Atlantic in the north. And it was the summertime, so it was miserable. There were black flies everywhere, and it was not warm, but it wasn't cold either. It was just wet. And I found this rock, and it had a fossilized fish in it, and I thought fossils are cool because I'm still like 12 years old and love dinosaurs. But I kept it because whenever I would touch the rock in my pocket, if I was really anxious, and I would feel all the grooves on it and feel, the shininess of the fish that had been fossilized, and I'd take me back that moment, standing on the Bering Sea, looking out as far as you could see. There was a polar bear off there that was kind of anxiety-provoking, but it wasn't too bad. But it brought me back to that moment and just how peaceful and how quiet and how cool it was to be up there. And every time I would get anxious, I'd rub this rock, and I'd feel like I was back there. Right? It would bring me back there, and that would help ground me. Right? Because if you recall that I talked about anxiety being worried about the future, right? Grounding yourself is bringing you back into the present. Right? And so just doing that with a rock for some people can be very powerful and very useful. But all those things you mentioned are great mindfulness techniques. Yeah?
Yeah, sometimes I find like going through some albums and old photos with family members, with friends, with like in special moments are kind of like very relieving and very stress relieving.
Absolutely, right? It could be any stimulus like that can work for different people. It doesn't have to be like, don't go off and everyone find a rock. It might not work for you, right? But things like photos or things like some people it's a teddy bear. Some people it's like a baby blanket that they still have and they sleep with. It could be anything, right? And then finally, obviously medication, right? So SSRIs, SNRIs. What's a really powerful tool, especially if you experience panic attacks, is a benzodiazepine, right? So quick-acting anxiolytic. And then finally, peer support, right? So peer support's a great tool. Works really well for some people and not so well for others. Right? It all depends on the individual. So what does anxiety look like? Well, this is where I get you to role play, and I know you were all like thinking, oh, maybe he's not going to do that. No, I'm going to do it. I'm going to force you to do it. So I'm going to hand out a couple case studies, okay? And in each case study, we have more people than case studies. So the way it's going to work is there's going to be a talker in the case study and a listener, right? And the rest of the table is going to be observers. And what I want you to focus on when you take a look at this case study and think about, right, because it doesn't give you too much information, it just gives you some information about the interaction between these two individuals and what they're experiencing, is I want you to, first of all, think about, as an observer, if you're watching this interaction, what does the body language look like, right? How is the listener behaving or talking to that individual that's trying to describe how they're feeling? Is the individual that's talking, right, are they closed off? Do they not want to talk about something? Do they seem like they're being pressed, right? It's really up to the two individuals that are engaging in this role play to determine how well or how not well it goes, right? But pay attention to those things, right? And the reason why we do this, so if you were to hire us to come into your workplace, which is typically what we do, the reason why we do this is because the only way that you can get good at having really difficult conversations is by practicing them, right? You can't get good at having difficult conversations and just say, like, I'm good at having those kind of conversations. No, that's not true for anyone, right? You actually have to practice them, right? Just like you have to practice throwing the ball and catching the ball. So when we go into workplaces and we work with managers, we do this because overwhelmingly managers are pretty bad at having difficult conversations, right? So I'm going to hand those out right now. Figure out who wants to be the employee and the employer, and we'll take 10 minutes and we'll do these case studies. Oh, and I should say, you're assuming the concern is anxiety, okay? let's stop there. I understand that's something you might not have resolved, or the person that was the employee might have been being a bit combative or difficult in order to make it more interesting. But we're going to stop, and I'd like someone to raise their hand. Doesn't matter who it is, but for the talker, okay. So for the individual that was presenting with the concern, what was difficult about doing this? What was difficult if you were the person that was experiencing the concern? So you were role-playing the person who was experiencing the concern. What was difficult about role-playing that position to that person? Okay, so you were the supervisor or the colleague that was responding to the concern. You were the employer, yeah. And so you were the supervisor, okay. And so it felt difficult to confront, okay. So confrontation, so that's difficult, right? It's always difficult to start a conversation, especially if the issue is performance-based, right? What else? What else is difficult? Yeah.
Or to be vulnerable to someone who supervises you and looks at your progress and how you're able to manage the job. So to say you're having those problems, so it's like, well, notice these kind of things, your first reaction is like, oh, no one complains, like what's wrong?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so she's saying it was difficult to be vulnerable, right? This idea that if you're being confronted with something and someone is talking to you, your immediate response is, well, someone complained about this, or someone, are people talking about me behind my back? So those are all absolutely.
I think that it's also difficult for an employer to set a tone so that whoever you are approaching, you try to present yourself as someone who's going to lead fairly. So you're not going to be judgmental. It's very important.
Tone setting, and especially tone setting can be difficult if you're in a work environment where typically that doesn't happen, right? If you're in a work environment where you don't really accommodate failure, or you don't really accommodate difference, right? You expect everyone to be the same. That's a very hard place to all of a sudden set a new tone, which is it's okay to talk to me, right? Because really the evidence is being no, it's not, right? What else? Saw another hand that went up. Yep.
Yeah, like I was the supervisor, and I think sometimes, like in a particular case, when you are trying to confront someone about something and they shut down and don't want to speak about it, so then they're like, well, yeah, I'm fine. And then where do you go from there? That's where I was stuck.
Right. So you're getting blocked. You're trying to empathize. Maybe you're going through all the right motions, but no, I don't want to talk to this. Yeah. No, yeah.
Okay, so I think also, I think a good way to start would be, maybe writing your email, okay, hi, so I got official complaint. Could you please write either brief report or put in a word that a supervisor later has something in front so they can discuss.
Yeah, absolutely, right?
So give some points and then ask, for employee to explain.
Yeah, that can be a solution. It really depends on the situation, though, right?
And then it is much easier to maybe put together and discuss it.
Yeah.
Actually, in our scenario, we start with what sort of support that we can provide in order to address any changes happening recently in your behavior or in your functionality. So starting the conversation with the needs of support instead of instead of just accusing you with some lack of doing this or that would be.
So that maybe that's not necessarily something that was difficult to do, but a solution to some of the problems that maybe other people are sharing. So positive position. So I think that's really important, and you're really smart because you're jumping the gun to the next module, where I talk about the accessible employment standard and why, despite the fact that it's legislation here in Ontario, there are some really great tools within that in order to make these conversations easier. Like, for example, having a written accommodation policy in your workplace where you sit down with the individuals and you say, hey, listen, we've got a great accommodation policy here. If you need one, these are the kind of accommodations that we've given in the past, right? So on and so forth, right? So positively positioning the conversation as opposed to making it about a negative, saying, hey, we really want to make sure that you know about the access that you have to these kind of supports, is a great start off, right? I call it the confidence sandwich. Right? You start with something positive, maybe go to the negative afterwards, then move back to the positive later on, right? Anything else? What else is difficult?
The person may be in denial, like doesn't need the confidence sandwich.
So whether it's because of a lack of insight, right, as part of a disease process, or whether it's just denial, right, the person doesn't want to admit to something going on, whether the person is obfuscating and they're trying not to let work on that something is happening, right? Particularly we see that in the context of things like substance use disorder or alcoholism. That can be really difficult, right, if the person is just not willing to engage in the conversation, right? So, again, we kind of jumped the gun because we said positive positioning. That's an easy way to maybe solve some of these issues that we experience, right, when we have those conversations. What's another thing that we can do in order to maybe address one of these difficulties we've been having? How can we address difficulty in confronting a staff member? How can we make that easier for us if we're a supervisor or a colleague? Yeah.
I think providing even like a safe space, starting off with setting up where you're even having that conversation, being aware of the space.
So we make connections to our environment. That's excellent, right? So if every time we get called into the boss's office, something bad happens, even though we're not dogs, right? Like it's not like we're dogs and we just understand this is the bad room, right? Like the crate is the bad thing for my dog. No, you know, if the boss's office, something bad always happens. Whenever you get called in there, is that a great place to be having a really difficult conversation, right? So either make sure your office is a pretty okay place to be, right? Or find a space that's going to be neutral, right? That's an excellent idea. What else? How about for vulnerability? How can we train ourselves to be more vulnerable?
Kind of leveling the play field, so let the person know that you also experience some problems in that area, or it's normal for individuals to experience.
So it's kind of this format's a bit different than usual workshops we do. But I self-disclosed about 10 minutes ago. Does that make anyone else feel a bit easier if they were to come up and talk to me about something that's going on? The fact that I self-disclosed? I mean, obviously I work for CMHA, so I'm not going to be really mean about mental health, right? Like that's, maybe it wasn't an issue before, right? But for some workplaces, especially workplaces I go into who are predominantly male, predominantly hyper-masculine, like cop shops or firefighters or banking industry or some law firms, and I do that, and then I have guys coming up to me afterwards and saying, you know what, I've really struggled with this, or I'm so glad you mentioned that, I felt that way before, or so on and so forth, right? So just being able to do that, absolutely, right? Saying that, hey, listen, this is normal, right? If you shouldn't feel bad about coming to me to talk about this, because if you had broken your leg in a car accident yesterday, I want you to tell me about that. What's the difference, right? Normalizing it. Right? What else? Yeah. Yeah.
Even when approaching the staff, instead of starting with the negative or the negative incident, it would be good to provide a positive feedback with a sandwich feedback, like positive, negative,
Yep.
positive, and instead of just saying, hey, this is what you did, and this is not acceptable. Yeah. So it has to be a little bit too easy into the topic.
Absolutely, right? So again, that positive, negative, positive, or that positive sandwich. That's a great tool to use if you're looking to make someone feel at ease, right? What I overwhelmingly would say is if the only time you have conversations with your staff or your colleagues is when something bad is happening or when a concern arises, then the conversation's always going to be difficult. But if you do regular check-ins, right, and you actively solicit information about how life is going for them. Like, hey, how's, I know you were out on vacation, or you went on your honeymoon the other month, or whatever, right? And they're used to talking to you about stuff. They're going to be more willing to talk to you about stuff when it's bad, too, right? So it's important to keep those lines of communication open, rather than only have conversations when bad stuff is happening, right? Otherwise, it's always going to be difficult. Yeah.
Well, I feel like in a workplace setting, it's important to set that from the beginning. So having that relationship as a manager with
Yeah.
your employees, as well as like employees having that supportive environment. So when there is something going on, you're able to openly communicate.
Yeah. And that's, someone mentioned it earlier about that tone, right? Tone, setting the tone from the get-go. I think CMHA does a great job of this. I'm going to plug my organization, because the minute you apply or you see a job advertisement for CMHA, it says we will accommodate you, including if you suffer from a mental health concern or disability. Right? Because oftentimes when you see the accommodation language in a job placement ad, people think, oh, physical disability, right? But just seeing right on the page that we'll accommodate a mental health concern if you have one is pretty powerful, right? Which opens it up then when you enter the workforce, and maybe you're doing on-the-job training, or you're doing your onboarding process, and you have to go through a module on mental health and mental illness, right? Just normalizing the conversation around it is a huge first step, and setting the standard or setting the example as a boss or as a supervisor, or even as a colleague, right? If you're bringing people onto your team. Great. So, the approach, we just kind of breezed through a bunch of stuff where we talked about it, right? I don't think I need to beat a dead horse, because that's cool. But really, it's about paying attention to stress on purpose, right? It's about paying attention to the fact that stress is normal, it's part of everyday life, but really focusing on when you're dealing with staff or you're dealing with clients, and noticing when that stress response is starting to get up there, right? And being able to bring them back down using some techniques that we'll talk about in a second, right? Just like we did the iceberg for depression, right? We could do the same exercise if we wanted to with anxiety. So this idea that only 20% of what we're seeing, or only what we're seeing is only 20% of the whole story or the whole problem, right? Starting with conversation about anxiety, right? So saying things like, I've noticed. Hey, I've noticed that there's, you seem to be having anxiety attacks. Or I've noticed that there are a lot of concerns, or you're exhibiting a lot of concerning behaviors, right? Or hey, I'm wondering if you've got a lot on your plate right now, and can we take something off that? Or can I help you with anything, right? Or do we need to assign someone else to the project as well so that you have support? Right? Just having those conversations, meeting them where they're at, instead of asking them right away to solicit information back to you. Active listening, the second step, right? If they're willing to open up and talk to you, then it means actively seeking out what is causing stress in the workplace, right? Because we all know the work is stressful. We all know that the work environment causes stress. So trying to mitigate that or eliminate that as much as possible is really your job as an employer or as a work colleague even too, right? Mental health is everyone's responsibility in the workplace, just like safety is everyone's responsibility. And finally, working together. We mentioned a few of these earlier, like identifying essential tasks, right? That's key, especially if someone is dealing with stress or anxiety. Even having, like we have a kitchen duty at my work, right? So every month, or every couple of weeks, you have kitchen duty, so you put all the plates that are dirty or cups that are dirty in the dishwasher, turn it on, wipe the counters, simple stuff. Not that big an issue, but you can imagine if you're really stressed and anxious and having to spend that extra half hour at the end of the day, it could be a lot for someone, right? And it's not to say that it's, we're babying them. No, it just means that, hey, listen, maybe we don't make you do that for the next month or so while you're trying to get through this hurdle or get through this hump, right? Chunking out work, right? So big projects, making sure that those pieces are manageable. Remember, if anxiety is worried about the future, it's really hard to do long-term planning, right? Progress monitoring and support, right? Making sure they're still on track and giving them positive feedback as they move through a project and move through a deal overall. Right? Understanding what the bigger picture is. Well, we talked about crisis, right? And we talked about a panic attack, acute signs of anxiety. So what might some acute signs of anxiety be? Acute signs, so like severe symptoms associated with anxiety.
Like sweat.
Sweating, good, yeah. Could be a panic attack, right? So this could certainly be a panic attack. But maybe it's not hit that threshold. Maybe it's a sub-panic attack. So what might some other things that are happening be?
Lack of sleep.
Like actually coming to work exhausted? Absolutely, yeah.
Inability to cope.
Yeah, so they're having difficulty coping with just normal stress, or they're having difficulty in normal interaction with people. What else? Yeah?
There's physical pain in the body too.
Yeah, like headaches, or migraines, or aches and pains, absolutely. Yep.
Unable to focus.
Yeah, they can't focus, right? They're having difficulty focusing. Maybe they're hyperventilating. Maybe they're crying a lot, right? Not necessarily the threshold of a panic attack, but they're just crying a lot. So these really acute signs of anxiety, right? So just like with a panic attack, mere concern or mere calm and acknowledged concern, right? You got to be that rock for them. So don't freak out and say, "Oh my God, it's going to be okay," right? Don't just say, "Okay, it's just anxiety, get over it." You know, suck it up, buttercup. No, that's not going to work. It's not going to be helpful, right? Inquire about medical conditions, right? Especially if they're complaining about certain pains, just like a panic attack. If they're actually having a heart attack, that's not good. Make sure you get an ambulance there. But really the biggest thing you can do is assist with some grounding techniques. How many people here have heard of 5 things you see, 5 things you hear? Yeah? Are you one of the clinicians that I asked? Yeah. Actually, do you want to describe it?
Well, it's just getting people to be present in the moment, so looking around and naming 5 things that you can literally see around you, or 5 things. Sometimes it's like 5 things you might feel, like the clothes on your back, or your temperature, or 5 things that you can hear, so it's like with vents or someone speaking. So it's just trying to get someone to literally be like their head over their feet, like in the moment.
Yeah, exactly, right? So remember we talked about anxiety being worried about the future, being this out-of-body almost experience. You're stuck up in your brain, right? It's this feeling of stuckedness, you're up here, while reconnecting you with your physical presence in the physical moment, and saying 5 things you see, right, is I see a column. And then after everything you see, you want to take a big, deep breath, right? And would you be surprised if I were to tell you that we breathe wrong in Canada? Does everyone know what I mean when I say that? We breathe wrong? We breathe wrong. We don't breathe properly. And why I say that is because I grew up in the 80s, and huge fan of Arnold Schwarzenegger, like Predator. Excellent movie. Love that movie. You know, in order to look like Arnold Schwarzenegger, what do? You suck in your stomach, you puff out your chest, you look really fit and trim, right? Well, all that's doing is that's depressing your diaphragm and not allowing your lungs to fill up with oxygen, so you're getting less oxygen, which is causing a physical stress reaction in your body, right? Because your body feels like it's not getting enough air. So in order to breathe properly, you actually have to push your stomach out in order to engage your diaphragm and allow your lungs to inflate, right? So it's almost like you're trying to push a balloon out of your belly button, is how I would describe it. Or blow a balloon up with your belly button, right? And then when you breathe out, your stomach relaxes. Right? And so you practice that as you're doing these 5 things you see, 5 things you hear, right? So after everything you see, right, 5 things, deep breath, and then after you've listed 5 things, you go to 4 things, and then 3 things, and then 2 things, and then 1 thing. And then if you're still having a bit of difficulty, you might ask, okay, can you say 5 things you hear now? So I hear the vent, or I hear you talking, or I hear the birds outside, or I hear a car horn, whatever it might be, right? And then if you can go to things you feel, so the chair underneath of you, or the ground underneath of you, or clothes on your back, or a hairpin that you have in your hair, whatever it might be, right? And ideally, you don't get to the point where you're asking about things you taste, because then you're like tasting a coffee and everything, that's gross. It's a joke. Right? Another great one is coloring. Anyone here do coloring? Yeah? That's a great tool for grounding or just for like getting in the moment. Right? I personally hate it. I can't stand the lines. I find it really frustrating. But for some people, it's like my mother-in-law has coloring books at home, and she does coloring. And it's easy for Christmas time to acquire coloring books. It's awesome. Meditation is another great tool, right? So some people mentioned that already. It could be whether it's a meditative practice that you do as part of a spiritual practice or a religious practice, or it could just be, you sitting down and trying to quiet your brain, quiet your mind. There's a few apps out there now. I think there's one called Calm and another called Mindfulness, or everyone know what I'm talking about? These apps on your phone that you can actually go through guided meditation or guided grounding techniques. Those are all great tools to use when we talk about anxiety or acute signs of anxiety. And finally, provide resources, right? So the worst thing you can do is just after you do this is say, okay, great, go home, see you tomorrow. right? If they're experiencing high levels of anxiety in the office, provide them with a resource, whether it's your EAP, a community resource that might exist, right? I just gave you one earlier, bounce back. Could be your benefits package, right? Normalize the use of benefits, right? Well, I always like to say, if you're comfortable going to your doctor once a year, right? I understand that the recommendation is no longer that we go to our doctor once a year for regular checkups, but if you're comfortable going to your doctor once a year, then why not do a mental health checkup once a year, right? Go see a social worker and just check in with them once a year, or a psychologist, or whoever. You have the benefits, use them. So what are some protective factors? Well, obviously, awareness of any environmental stressors that might exist, right? What is your environment like? Is it really hectic? Is it really loud? Is it really noisy? Understanding good coping and grounding skills, some of which we just talked about. Really, predictability and stability, right? Having a predictable and stable work environment is a great indicator of a healthy work environment, but also a great protective factor when it comes to anxiety and stress, right? Because there are people out there, and there are people that experience this, that work is like work is where they go to not be stressed anymore, right? And if you have a really safe and great workplace, that could be the place where they show up every day, and they're really happy to be there because stuff might not be so great at home. Or they might be having difficulty with housing or whatever it is, and work is the place they go in order to get a resolution of some of those symptoms associated with high stress, right? So make work that place for some people. The Big Four. I always talk about this. Has anyone heard about the Big Four before? Any of the social workers or nurse? Social worker? No one's heard about the Big Four before? Cool. All right. So the Big Four, it comes from sports psychology, and I kind of gave you an example of it before, right? So it's this idea that if the quarterback is throwing, well, it's the NFL, and they were noticing that during the big game or during playoff season, people would make silly mistakes, right? Like they fumble the ball, they were about to get a touchdown, and they fumble the ball, it would just drop out of their hands, right? And the reason for that, they determined, was it was anxiety, right? It was performance anxiety. They were really anxious and stressed about performing poorly with millions of people watching, and they wanted a way to solve this. And so they got together a bunch of sports psychologists and sports physicians and stuff like this, and they developed the Big Four. And of course, it being the NFL, and they did so well with chronic traumatic encephalopathy, right? They just said, you know what, we're not going to use this. We spent all this money developing it, we're not going to use it. It sat around for a little bit, or the concept behind it sat around for a little bit, then it was picked up by the SEAL teams. First out of Quantico with Dev Grew, and then it went out to all the SEAL teams in the United States. And it's just being picked up by pretty much every major league sport, whether it's baseball or hockey or football, being picked up by the Canadian military, being picked up by the RCMP, police forces, firefighters, really any job where you're experiencing high degrees of stress. And it's 4 steps that we can take in order to help to mitigate stress response when there's a high likelihood of there being chronic stress in the workplace, right? Whether that's combat in the case of special forces or combat forces, or the big game in the case of football or hockey, or maybe just end of fiscal year for accountants, whenever that might be, right? And the first step is smart goal setting. Does everyone know what I mean when I say smart goal setting? It's why none of our New Year's resolutions work, right? So what does smart goal setting mean? What is the S? Specific. M is measurable. A is attainable. R is realistic. And T is time-bound, right? Good, right? So you set a smart goal. And in the context of like regular workplace stress, maybe it's not like, I'm going to make it to the end of the big game without, this injury bothering me, or I'm going to make it through the next week because you're out on patrols in Kandahar, whatever it might be. But it could just be like, I'm going to make it to the end of the week and have enough energy to walk my dog on Friday night instead of just letting it out in the backyard. Right? That could be a goal. That's a smart goal because it's specific. It's walking the dog. It's measurable. Did you take the dog out for a walk or did you not? It's attainable, certainly. You have a leash, you have a dog, you don't have to steal the dog, right? It's realistic. And it's time-bound. It's on Friday, right? So that's a smart goal. Next is mental rehearsal. So in order to actually achieve that goal, you have to think about the steps that it takes to get there. Right? So maybe for you, in order to have enough energy to do that, it means, I'm going to wake up every morning and go to the gym, and this is what it's going to look like. You're actually visualizing going to the gym every morning, right? And then you're visualizing handing in that report on Friday. You know the report's due, so you're visualizing handing in the report. And then you're visualizing yourself walking in the door and the dog goes nuts, and you put the leash on it and you take it outside right away. And you visualize this process. Right? The reason it's so effective is because it's pretty surprising. You'll take a person that has trouble catching a ball, right? And you'll tell them, visualize the ball leaving the quarterback's hands, flying through the air, and you grabbing it in your hands. And as they're running down the pitch and they're visualizing it, they'll actually grab the ball, right? We use this all the time when we teach basic marksmanship skills at the infantry school. And it works, like someone that's never done training before, and it works for them. Positive self-talk is the next step. So you actually talk about how you can positively achieve that goal, right? And it sounds kind of silly. The best way to do it is out loud, right? So you say good things about yourself. You say good things about how you're going to get there. You say good things about how you're going to achieve the goal. Because what happens when we're anxious or we're depressed? What do we tend to do? Say really negative things about ourselves, right? Or say really negative things about our ability, right? Or we catastrophize. Oh, we're not going to get there. We're not going to finish this. A bad thing's going to happen, right? We engage in those cognitive distortions. So just being able to talk positively has a great effect on our performance, right? Or us getting through a really tough period of time. And then finally, arousal control, deep breathing, right? Actually breathing properly, taking the time to breathe properly, right? And ideally doing this as you go through the process. Does this make sense to everyone? Yeah? Does everyone see how it can be used in just any setting? Doesn't matter what it is. Set a goal. Rehearse the goal. Say good things about yourself, which is hard to do sometimes. And then just breathe. Right? There's a pretty simple 4 steps that you can take just to limit anxiety when you're in a chronically stressful environment. What are the benefits? Well, the benefits are that when we address this in the workplace, we see a return on investment. And most of us are not in a job where the return on investment is monetary, right? I mean, some of us, that obviously plays a factor. But what would your return on investment be? Anyone? What would your return on investment be? Or a positive return on investment be? I'll tell you what it is for me. It means that when I engage with my trainers that are across the country, or I come in and do a workshop like this, I have at least one person at the end of it, I'm not telling you that you have to do this, but I have at least one person at the end of it that comes up and says, you know, I'm really happy you came. That's my return on investment, right? Or my return on investment when the workplace is taking care of mental health is I feel okay when I get an email at like 3 in the morning saying, you know, I don't need to answer that right now. And I don't feel stressed about that. Because I've worked in jobs where I felt stressed about that, right? Like the boss sends a 3 a.m. email and you're like, oh my God, why are they up this early? And are they expecting me to respond? And you're going through like this cycle, like, do I respond or do I wait? Or do I, right? And just feeling good enough to say, you know, I can wait until I'm in the office at 9 or whatever. Right? So that's my return on investment. Your return on investment might be that you have clients that are happy, healthy, and engaged in their communities, right? Your return on investment might be that you have enough energy at the end of the day to go home and do things that you enjoy doing, right? It could be anything, right? It doesn't have to be monetary in nature. We're improving attendance and productivity, right? We talked about presenteeism earlier. Well, you're going to improve people showing up to work and not calling in sick. And you're enhancing team learning behavior, right? So every team is a learning organization. Teams learn together the more they work together. And you're enhancing that process if you're taking care of their psychological health and safety. That's pretty straightforward. Finally, preventative awareness and informed responding improves knowledge of trigger strengths and solutions, right? So you're going to get better at recognizing what the issue is, addressing the issue with the individual, and then solving the issue potentially if it's a workplace-related issue, right? You're going to get better at that, and it's going to be more efficient. So we're going to take, I think, 5 minutes. Go to the washroom, get a coffee, and then we'll kick off with the last bit.